Okay, I just present myself first. My name is Niklas Ranninger. I'm responsible for the Nordic markets. I'm delighted to say that we've just opened up our office in Stockholm. So for Board Beer, it's an important move because we've never actually had a full-time presence in that market. I mean, I personally have been covering the Nordic markets since October 2010. As you probably get from my accent, I'm not Irish. I just have to clarify that I'm actually French, but I've been working with Ireland some way or the other since '94, so I have a relatively good understanding of Ireland. So what I'd like to talk about, obviously, is about the Nordic markets. I'd like first to clarify one point, is Scandinavia and Nordics. I make that difference because if you're looking at Finland, that is not in Scandinavia, and that's an important element to understand because the Finnish do not like to be associated with the Scandinavians. And we'll look at what is actually, there are some very strong similarities in between the different countries in the Nordics, but there are also some important differences that you need to be aware of. Then I'll just go rapidly through some of our exports into those markets because there are some trends which can be of interest for yourselves. And then looking more in details into the retail, the food service market, but also in the food manufacturing over there because that can also, one, be obviously an element of competition that you need to be aware of, but also in some occasions can be also some opportunities there. And finally, a few tips of how to do business within the Nordic market. I have about half an hour, so you can interrupt me at any moment if there's any clarification. Sorry. In terms of the overall market, the total GDP, which is basically represents the economy of the country, is 1.11 trillion euros, so it's pretty significant. Population is 25 million, and it can be broken down as roughly you have 10 million people in Sweden, 5 in Norway, 5 in Denmark, and 5 in Finland. What you can see here from the map is actually the density of the population. The population tends to be down in the south where it's warm and the sunlight and also all along the coastline. So you see very concentrated pockets of population. In terms of country, Sweden is the third biggest country in Europe. And if actually you flip around Sweden, get the top heading down to the south, you reach Rome. So it just gives you an idea of the size of that country in length. That has an impact, obviously, in terms of logistics. In terms of spending per household, we're in the same average of a lot of other European markets. Somewhere in between 11 and 14% of household spending goes for food. In terms of our exports, it's the 9th export market when you take the 4 countries put together for a value of 260 million euros. And it increased by 12.5% in 2010. So I was saying similarities, but with differences. The similarities are the cultural and the language, obviously. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have languages which are pretty similar. They're capable of understanding each other. Finland is a totally different language. It's more Hungarian type of language. Also, the other important similarities is a very strong interlinked businesses in between the different countries, and we'll be seeing that further on several of my slides. It's true for ICA, which is one of the major Swedish retailers, but true also for Coop. But you also see that at manufacturing level. Now, what are the differences? Norway, obviously, is not in the EU, but it is in the EEA, which is the European economical area. So there are some kind of agreements with the EU regarding exports, but it means that exporting to Norway, you're no longer really exporting into the EU. There are some specific blockage points that you have to take into equation. Obviously, Norway has its own currency. Sweden has also its own currency. Sweden is in the EU, but its own currency. For roughly 9.12 crowns for the euro. Denmark has its own currency, but it's pinned to the euro, so it's flat basically. And Finland has the euro. So there you have the differences. So yeah, that's it. Now, if we look more into details in between of the differences and particularities of these countries, I've called out the population size, so Sweden is the major country. It also, surprisingly, has the biggest economy in front of Norway. See, it's 356 billion euros, whereas Norway is 330, not far behind. In terms of VAT, we will see there's some very big differences. The VAT on food in Sweden is 12%, but 25% service VAT at the restaurant level. In Finland it's 13%, and in Norway it's 14%. In Denmark it's 25%, all over categories. It's huge. In terms of, so if we try to look here, what are the particularities of these countries? One, I suppose, Sweden, biggest economy. Norway, biggest income. You have here GDP per capita is 67,000 euros per capita. Denmark, the particularity is a very high VAT. Also, we'll see later on a move towards discount products. Finland, its particularity, as we see further on in other sides, is a highly concentrated retail market. We'll see that Sweden, Denmark, and Finland have highly concentrated retail markets, but it is particularly true for Finland. If we look now at our exports into the Nordics, see the beef is a very part of our exports. 42% of the 260 million worth of exports from Ireland, followed by prepared food, which is 15%, and beverages. In terms of where our exports are going, Sweden represents 47%, so it's a big chunk of what is going into the Nordics is going to Sweden, followed by Denmark, which is 39%. What is interesting is to see the evolution here within these different markets. If you remember, I said there was 12.5% increase into the Nordics overly. But if you look at it per country, the growth in 2010 was 9% into Sweden, but 19% into Denmark. If you actually look through those figures, and you have to always be very careful, these are statistics, customs figures, but it's always interesting as a trend. What is growing the exports into Sweden at the moment is the seafood products, and in Denmark it would be the meat categories and the dairy products. Retail business. Now this, as I said, a highly concentrated market, but when you see this slide, you see all of these logos, and it's actually, you have the complete opposite impression. The reason for that is that the retail groups are highly concentrated, but they have a lot of different brand stores. From a consumer point of view, they are faced with all of these different stores. But if you look now at the groups themselves per countries, you see here ICA, and you'll see ICA Europe, see them appear in the different markets. So this is again how you see the interlinked business within the Nordics is very strong. ICA has a dominant position in Sweden, followed by Coop and Axfood. To make it simple, you could say those three retailers nearly account for 3/4 of the retail business in Sweden. Axfood, for instance, also, that's the name of the retail multiple. You won't see one single store carrying Axfood. It's one of the retail brands which is behind that. Denmark, you have Coop again, and you have Dansk. Those are the two major ones, and then you have Dagofar. The business from Coop, because you have Coop here, you have the Coop also in Norway, is pretty separate. They're among the same group, but they cover their own markets. Finland, you have the S Group and Kesko account. Those two retail groups hold 3/4 of the retail business in Finland. So you see highly concentrated retail market. Now there's one area which I think is interesting is the private label. It's usually considered that a mature private label market has a market share of 40% of private label, and that you'll see that, for instance, in the UK and in Germany. If you look at the private label market share in the Nordic countries, Sweden is at 18%, Denmark is 17%, Norway 11%, and Finland 10%. Now there are some reasons for this low level. And one of the reasons is because they are small countries with small populations. So, and as we saw early on, despite the fact that the retailers are very concentrated, they have all of these branches under different brands. So for them, it's kind of tricky to display onto the market their private labels. I don't know if you follow me on that. However, there is a growing interest on that because obviously one is a major point of differentiation for them against their competitors. And a retailer like Axfood has a target of bringing up their private label at up to 25%. The other interesting thing about the private label, and we'll see that later on, is that the Nordic markets have very strong entrance barriers through duties in terms of environmental taxes, in terms of plastic, which is on the packaging, and on terms of cardboard and things like that, and also taxes on sugar level. Denmark will be introducing on the 1st of October a duty on fat content, a whole range from meat onto bakery products. And that has to be paid by someone in the supply chain, which usually means that if you want to work with a retailer, you'll probably have to go through an importer who will take charge of that. The fact that the retailer owns, obviously, his own private label means that they take the responsibility of paying those duties, which makes it much easier for yourselves. These are a couple of key figures about the retail markets. As I've just said early on, retail market is highly concentrated, especially in Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. In Norway, we didn't really look much into that pie chart, but it was a bit more fragmented. That might be changing now because IKEA is actually in the process of selling its hypermarkets in the Norwegian, where they've lost a lot of money, and they're going to be potentially purchased by the Norge Group, which means that we are going through a consolidation and concentration within that market. I mentioned about the private label opportunities. There's growing discount share, and that is particularly led by Netto, which belongs to the Dansk Group. Obviously, you will find Aldi and Lidl in those markets, but they have a relatively recent position, and it's only very recently, only the last 1 or 2 years, that they've succeeded in finding their ground in those markets. At the beginning, they found it very, very difficult to establish themselves in that market. There's a very strong interest in organic and healthy food. Here you have the Krav, which is the Swedish organic logo, but you have here also an interesting logo which they call is called the Green Keyhole, and it's basically a scheme which is run by the Swedish Ministry and the Danish Ministry of Food, and it helps the consumer identify healthy foods. There's a lot of emphasis put both by the state but also within those countries to do anything to do with health diet. This is an interesting graph which shows you the interest rate, the spending in euros for organic food, and you see here the level for Denmark and Sweden, which is here. It's as high as in Switzerland. So it is definitely, for anyone doing organic products, it's definitely an interest there. This is the usual route to market chart. Obviously, you can decide to work directly with the retail multiples. In terms of specialized retailers, there aren't that many in comparison to other markets. You do, however, have it for the alcohol because there's a monopoly in both Sweden, Norway, and Finland in the distribution of alcohol at retail level. ICA, I put ICA in there because it's interesting. ICA, obviously, you all know, familiar with ICA, but they are the biggest distributor of meatballs, which is a very popular item in the Nordics. So interesting to see that. I think direct route access here is extremely difficult in the Nordic markets because, for the reasons I mentioned early on, the duties, that it has to be paid by someone along the supply chain. And obviously the retailers, as they are and you're familiar with, they won't want to pay that. So it often means that you'll be better off talking to an agent who will guide you through the process of that, or actually working directly with an importer, unless, and that's what is very interesting, you work with the private label, because obviously the private label is the ownership of the retailer, so it's up to the retailer to take care of that. So that's another interesting element towards private labels for that market. Food service. The total food service market is estimated at approximately 21.2 billion euros. That is excluding social catering. Its market is highly fragmented, with no food service outlet having any market share superior to 10%. Key trend, as I've already mentioned earlier, is towards healthy products. Fast food is also growing in those markets. Full restaurant service is growing in popularity, except for Denmark. What is happening is that the food service concept, like the traditional restaurant where you would go out in the evening with your family or friends, is not really a Nordic thing, and that is starting to appear in the market. Denmark is not in that trend, because at the moment there's very strong focus towards low-cost solutions. Now, if we look, and I'll go rapidly through this slide. To summarize quickly, we'll see they're all fragmented. Usually you are looking at the food service sector with over 70% of independence within those markets. So it's highly fragmented, so it's pretty tricky to get in that directly. The key players in Sweden is McDonald's. Keep in mind that McDonald's will always less than 10% market share of the food service, and this will be the same for the others. In Denmark, McDonald's, 7-Eleven, and Jensen Bofors. Jensen Bofors is specialized meat restaurant chain. 7-Eleven is a very interesting, it's a small retail structure on the go type of store, and they do a lot of sales of panini, breads, pizzas, things, and those types. So they're quite important in Denmark and also in Sweden. In Norway, you have Umo Catering, which owns outlets such as Pep's Pizza and Handel's Burger Kings. You have McDonald's, Norgesgruppen. Interesting with Norgesgruppen is that they are also, if you remember early on, they are also a retailer in Norway. In Finland, key players Burger in Oy and the S-Group. S-Group also, again, is also a retailer. So there are some perhaps opportunities if you're developing one area, for instance, the retail, to try and hop into the food service category. The forecast, now to take with precaution, because this was done by Euromonitor, but it might be an interesting indicator. The planned growth in between 2009 and 2014 for the food service sector is 13% in Sweden. So it's within these four countries, that is where the growth is foreseen to happen. Denmark is actually foreseen to drop by 2%. And that is a lot to do with a trend towards discount fast food formats. Norway is at a 5% growth, and Finland is flat at 1%. Obviously, this is taking in equation the economical situation we are facing in Europe. I will go rapidly through this slide. It's more for your own information to take back afterwards. We're looking here at the breakdown outlets per category within the different markets. So full service restaurants in Sweden is quite popular. So that's one area where there might be of interest if that's an area you want to target, compared to the other countries where it's much smaller. Then you have fast food is a big thing obviously in the different countries, ranging from 20 to 35%. One element which I myself are quite surprised, because it looks quite small here, is the street kiosk, which is very popular. If some of you have been into the Nordics, you'll see a lot of kiosks on the streets selling fast food solutions. But it's around 3% in most of the markets. So having said that, in Finland it's 8%, so it's quite high. And often these are, in some way or another, linked in with one of the major food manufacturers within that country. So accessing the food service supply chain, obviously here again you can go directly. You have the big operators, the big guys like Sodexo and Compass, but you also have the likes of McDonald's. Max House is an interesting, that's a Swedish food service, and but you can also channel through the distributors such as Inco, Martin Olsen, Metro, Menigo. Now I'll just say a few words on that because there is some consolidation happening at the moment. Menigo, for those who are working with Break, is an interesting one because Break has purchased Menigo, I think it was 1 year ago. So if you already have a category in Break, you have good chances in getting that into Sweden. Inco has just been purchased by AB Catering. Cervera has just purchased Martin Olsen. So you see there's some consolidation happening there. Indigenous manufacturers. There's some very heavyweight players out there. There's just a couple of logos up there. Just to give you a couple of ideas on terms, Arla is 6 billion euros turnover. Tulip, which belongs to the Danish Crown, which is the biggest pig manufacturer in the world, I think it's the same region, 6.5 billion euros. Findus, I don't know if you're familiar with, was actually at the origin a Swedish company. You have the Hilton Group. Carlsberg is the fourth biggest brewery distributor. So just for your, in terms of the business model over there, you can realize there's some very significant players. However, they can be partners or customers, either for the raw material supplies, but also from semi-processed products or ingredient solutions, or sometimes even just developing a partnership with them in order to get, because they have usually very strong built brands. In understanding a country, I always think it's interesting to just look at the overall business, and I'm always astonished to see how those countries which are very small population have these major companies. So let's just look quickly very through. Danish Crown, I've already mentioned, biggest pig manufacturer in the world. Marine Harvest in Norway, I think they account for 3/4 of the world's salmon production. You have Arla, which has 20,000 farmers in its cooperative and has a turnover around of 6 billion euros. You have IKEA, I mentioned over, Lego, obviously you're familiar with, but you have Volvo. Lantmännen, which is a cooperative which does bakery products, here again in a range of 8 billion euros of turnover. You have Nokia, Sony Ericsson, Maersk, which is one of the biggest freight. I know this is out of the food picture, but just it gives you an idea of the people you have behind, is that there's a real sense of business. And one thing about them I find is they don't like confrontation. There are people which will be prepared to talk to you and try and find a solution rather than go straight into a fighting process. Just things to know about the Nordic market. The retail side selling price might be deceptive, because bear in mind the VAT, which is very high. So keep that. When you look at the Danish prices, there's 25% VAT on that. So that you have to be aware of. Very strong entrance barriers because of the duties. It's in terms, even not just about the money, but even in terms of the legal requirements, the administrative work which is required is a very big constraint. Very strong national preference. It's particularly true for Sweden. I know you'll hear that in all markets, but it is extremely true in the Swedish market. Price conscious, very true for Denmark. And as we saw early on, the presence of heavyweight indigenous manufacturers. A few little tips of how to do business with the Nordics. Appointments have to be prepared 3 to 4 weeks ahead. They're very organized, very structured people. Extremely open book. For anyone who has been done any business there, it's surprising. In any conversation, very rapidly, you'll know the turnover they're doing, who they're working with. The one thing you have to realize is obviously if they're open book, they expect the same thing from yourselves. The buyers have extremely good knowledge. Usually the buyers in the Nordics are very high profile, have high academic background, so they have very good understanding of the product category. BRC is an ideal, IFS is a requisite. I put think global, act local, because as I said, the Nordics can be approached as a global thing, but still saying that, it's, I think it's useful to pick one country, especially for instance Sweden, which has the size to kind of develop your position within the Nordic markets because it has the population, and then to spread out into the other countries. Nordic business culture, I mentioned open book. Short line communication. They don't have the hierarchy you would find such as in Italy or France. You can talk very easily to a top manager in a company. Having said that, when you're doing business, it sometimes can be counterproductive. The manager will just assume that you should be talking to the buyer. But it does help because you can talk very easily, you can pick up the phone and talk to the key people in the companies. There's a very high standard on quality and design. Just a little thing, handshake. The Nordics, they're not cozy. You know, they are a nation which keeps their distances. So no hugging, nothing. There's just a firm and fast handshake. About what are the assets, I suppose, that you can put forward on top of your obvious, on your own business and on the quality of your products, is that there is a strong presence of Irish products within those markets. We are the major supplier of beef into Sweden. We also, our whiskey brands are extremely popular in the Nordics. So that means there's a good understanding of the market, about the structure and also the logistics going into that market. They are very big into anything to do with nature, natural and ecological. And obviously that's Ireland. There's a lot of very strong benefits there that you can portray in your talks. Also, I recommend that you put forward the export knowledge and expertise. And at the end, the Irish culture, they have an interest in Irish music and literature and sport. There will be a lot of people from Norway and Sweden and Denmark traveling over to Ireland for playing golf and fishing. So these are the things which you can link into your relation. The targets for marketplace, I will be targeting 130 buyers. It's not my objective, it's not to get 130 buyers, but that's my overall target, and I will obviously be adapting following the conversations I've had with yourselves today. My final aim is to have somewhere between 20 and 25 buyers to come over. And the key ones is to get the retailers, the key importers, and the wholesalers to attend, and also some of the fine food retailers. Why work with the Nordics? I think the currency is one big thing. At the moment with what's happening with the Eurozone, I think the fact that you have Norway and Sweden which are not pinned to the euro, it means that you might be in a position to be very competitive within those markets. Also, most of them have a very healthy economy, and also most of these countries have actually a balanced state budget. And also, despite the fact that sometimes it can take time to develop business, but their people are extremely loyal in doing business. Once you've established something, it will go on running for decades. So here again, I've just finished. I tight for time, so I'll be delighted to answer any other questions. I've got my address here. Said I've just opened up the office in Stockholm. So if ever you travel over to Sweden, you're more than welcome to come to see me. We have facilities. If ever you want to arrange meetings, there's some space for there. Thank you.